What is going on, all you Pokemon collecting maniacs out there? This is Ryan, the PikiPikaPapa, and right, wrong, or indifferent, everybody is comparing Prismatic Evolutions to Evolving Skies. And there's certainly some validation behind it. There's some reasons behind it. Obviously, I think a lot of us feel very strongly that Umbreon is going to be the big chase card in Prismatic Evolutions. And obviously, you have the Moonbreon in Evolving Skies. You know, there's obviously a great Eeveelution lineup in both. It's just, there's a lot. And plus, people want there to be a new Evolving Skies, right? Evolving Skies was the big set from the Sword and Shield era. That Moonbreon, it was the set of the era. Like, of course, all of us are excited to try and figure out what the next Evolving Skies is. But with all of that excitement, I always try and ground myself in data. And that's because, you know, humans, we're very emotional creatures and we can get kind of caught up in the moment. We can get caught up in the hype. We can get caught up in the FOMO. So I always try and take lessons from the past, apply them to the present, to give me some idea what might happen in the future. I know how hard you work for your money. I know how hard I work for my money. And whenever I'm making investments or purchases here in the Pokemon space, I like to, you know, have as much information at my fingertips as I can when I'm doing that. So with that being said, today we're going to be looking at Evolving Skies singles and even a Fusion Strike single and see how they performed over their first year. Now, I will also say this before we get into it. At the very end, we're going to look at some Scarlet and Violet singles too, because I feel like the Pokemon investing and collecting space now is different than it was 3 years ago. Remember, Evolving Skies is a little over 3 years old now. I think there are more investors and collectors today than there were before. I think people are realizing, you know, the opportunity here. And I think a lot of these cards that are going to be big chase cards further down the road, I think people are buying them earlier, which might mean we don't see the Pokemon pop and flop like we have in the past. We might just see some of these cards come out, hit a certain price point, and hold it steady for a long time. So anyways, we're going to talk about that at the end. Obviously, we're going to do a ton of data in this video, and I had a ton of fun pulling it together. It was great for me to get back to kind of the Sword and Shield era and remember how everything was, because Scarlet and Violet has been it's been really awesome. It's been very different, but it's been very awesome. So obviously, I'm a big fan on taking lessons from the past. So with all that being said, before I get into it, I will say this video is a ton of work and I enjoy every second of it. But if you haven't hit the subscribe button yet and you find value in this, hit that subscribe button. If you don't mind, if you like what you see, give us a thumbs up. And if you got questions or comments, drop them down below. I got a small channel. Those 3 little things go a long way in helping me out, and I really appreciate it. So with that out of the way, let's start off with my data set. So as I said, I wanted to kind of go back to Evolving Skies, the big set from the Sword and Shield era with the Moonbreon, the big card from the Sword and Shield era, and just kind of track how the cards had moved over time. So you will see August of 21 is when Evolving Skies came out. November of 21 is when Fusion Strike came out. So I have a different columns and rows here, and I'll kind of walk you through it in the beginning, and then we'll get into the trend analysis here in a minute. But I have that start column right there, and that is the starting price of the raw card and the PSA 10 card. Now, the starting price of the card is obviously one of the first sales on the day that the set was launched. So that's kind of like your starting point for raw card prices. Now, PSA 10s, as we know, you've got to open the packs, you got to pull the card, you got to send it to PSA, it's got to get graded, it's got to get sold. There is a longer tail for that first PSA 10, but those PSA 10 prices are the very first PSA 10 price that was actualized. Now, if you want to know how I can see that information, I use Pokedata.io. There's a link down below. You have to have a subscription to see this far back. I do. I find value in it. Use my code if you're going to do it. I get a little kiss on the cheek for it. So anyways, that's how I can see this information. I find it highly valuable when I'm doing stuff like this. So you have the starting raw price right there, and then you also have the starting PSA 10 price. So then I thought, okay, let's look 6 months after a set came out. What were the prices then? So then I have the price of the raw card and the PSA 10 card after 6 months. And then I said, okay, let's look 1 year out. So the same thing, raw card, PSA 10 price, 1 year after the set came out. And then I have those 2 columns to the right. I have the now column, which is the current price at the time of shooting this video, and I have the PSA 10 population, which I think is really important. We always talk about supply and demand, and that's what drives prices in the Pokemon space, right? Like, supply is one thing. In my mind, a big component to supply in the Pokemon space is the overall PSA 10 population, and obviously demand is the most important part. You can have 4 of a version of a card in a PSA 10, and if nobody wants it, it doesn't matter. And you could have 14,000 of a card in a PSA 10 like you have in the Umbreon, and the price is still $1,500, right? Because the demand is so high. So you never just want to look at one without the other. So we're going to look at that as well. So with that being said, let's see how some of these cards moved over time. And here is where we started off with. So I started looking at the very first year raw card and PSA 10 price movement, just to say this. Okay, listen, Evolving Skies came out in November of 21. You know, Fusion Strike came out, or excuse me, Evolving Skies was August of 21. Fusion Strike was November of 21. Let's look all the way through one full year. And so you can see The first year it went through the Pokemon pop and flop, which we used to see a lot in the Sword and Shield era. Now I'm going to share a couple slides at the end and look at Scarlet and Violet and say why it might not be applicable to today. But when you look at this, I mean, look at the 1 year change. Everything universally across the board was down. Even the Moonbreon. The Moonbreon's raw card price was down after a year. The PSA 10 price was down. And then when you look at it, the real regression, I mean, all of them regressed significantly over the course of the year, which is interesting to look at. But when you look at it, I mean, the PSA 10 prices, which I have highlighted here in blue, you have big drops in that as well, right? All the way across the board. Big PSA 10 price drops. Big, you know, I used to call it the Pokemon pop and flop, right? Everything comes out, and then as the card come out, the demand is high, more packs are ripped, more people are selling, which means the supply is increasing. The demand is met, so demand comes down as supply increases, and you reach this kind of equilibrium where demand and supply are kind of working together, and that's where you find a baseline price for a lot of these cards, and that's what we saw in the Sword and Shield era. So that is what was going on the very first year. So the next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to say, okay, let's assume that you bought all of these cards, right? Let's say that you bought all of these cards at different intervals. What kind of return could you expect? Now, if you had bought these in the very beginning, now remember, if you had bought it on day one from that slide we just looked at, and you had held it through that 1 year mark, everything was red. Everything was red. Remember, hold that into your minds as we go through that. Everything was red after 1 year. However, if you had bought all of these cards at the start mark and then you had held it till now, you held onto these cards for a little over 3 years, right? This is where the prices would be. Now, the Moonbreon crushed it. However, remember, the Moonbreon was the card of the Sword and Shield era, the #1 card from the #1 set in the Sword and Shield era. So if you bought the raw card at $320 on the day the set launched, guess what? That card is worth $821 today. You would be up 157%. And even if you couldn't wait, even if you bought the very first PSA 10 that hit the market at $1,050, guess what? The card has performed so well, you would still be up 37%. Now, what do we see in some of these other cards? Well, raw cards is where you see a little bit of gain, right? The Leafeon, the raw card would be up. Start price back then was $140. It's $215 now. Up 54% over the course of 3 years. Thumbs up. Really, really solid gain over the course of 3 years. Glaceon right there, you would have bought at $166. Now it's up at $189, so you would have seen a gain. But guess what? Lots of losses too, right? If you had bought those PSA 10s, besides the Moonbreon, all three of those PSA 10s are down today, 3 years later versus where those very first ones sold for. So keep that in mind as we see these new sets that are coming out. Now, if you get to the 6-month mark, let's say, hey, listen, you were waiting a little bit, you were kind of gauging how the market reacted, and you saw at the 6-month mark, you're like, you know what? Evolving Skies is going to be something super special. So you waited to 6 months and you bought all of these cards. Let's see where you would be at today. Well, guess what? You're up. I mean, literally the only three things that are down, which is very interesting to look at, is your PSA 10 Leafeon, your PSA 10 Glaceon, and your PSA 10 Sylveon. And again, remember, that's at the 6-month mark. So still, a lot of those cards were being sent in. A lot of them hadn't hit the market yet. The PSA 10 population was still relatively low compared to where it is today. If you look at those cards, I mean, heck, in the Espeon from Fusion Strike, you got 6,800. The Sylveon, you got 8,200. The Glaceon, you got 6,200. The Leafeon, you have well over 6,000 of all of these cards in the market right now. So at 6 months, the PSA 10 prices were still high compared to where they are now, but all of the raw cards are up, which is really interesting. Then let's say that you were super skeptical and you were like, you know what, I'm not even pulling the trigger at 6 months. I'm gonna wait until 1 year out to buy these cards. Well, everything starts to turn green except the Espeon VMAX in a PSA 10. That is the only one that is down. Now, you muted some of your gains on the Moonbreon, right? You see that the raw card went from, if you bought it at 6 months, you'd be up 245%. If you bought it at a year, you'd be up 163%. But outside of that, your gains are pretty positive. So really for Evolving Skies, and this was true for a lot of the Sword and Shield era, you know, it was worth it to wait a year. You know, you could gain a lot of information over that first year before you pulled the trigger on singles cards. You could know what the big chase cards, you could get a really good feeling for the direction everything was heading, and you could make some really informed decisions. So if you bought these at the 1 year mark, look at all of those gains. Like I said, everything is significantly up except for that PSA 10 from that Espeon and Fusion Strike. Now, Fusion Strike was an interesting set. If you don't remember, Fusion Strike came out and nobody liked it. Like the booster boxes were $90 for about the first, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 months before the hobby finally started to realize how awesome the set was. So that was just a cool call out on Fusion Strike. But I thought this was interesting to see how these big chase cards that command so much value right now performed throughout the first year of their life cycle and where they're at now if you had bought at different intervals. Now, I had also said that things have changed, and they have. I think I don't know if it's for the better or for the worse, but it is what it is. It's the state that we're in. I think there's more investors and collectors right now, and I think people are identifying these awesome cards very early. I don't think we're seeing quite the Pokemon pop and flop that we did in the past, which means that some of these cards come out and they actually appreciate in value over the first 6 months or the first year, or they at worst hold steady eddies. So when you look at the Greninja, the Charizard from 151, and the Magikarp from Paldea Evolved, I thought I would graph this out and kind of see how things are moving. Same thing, start 6 month, 1 year, and now with the population in PSA 10 over to the right. And you can see they all have been around for 6 months. Greninja from Twilight Masquerade just hit the 6 month mark, and that is up. It's up 90%, right? Started off at $155, which I thought was pretty high, but the market doesn't care what I think. It's up 90%, up at almost $300 over the first 6 months, right? And even the PSA 10 is up. Even though there's 2,389, even though the PSA 10 population is growing with every passing day, it is still up versus that very first PSA 10, which sold for $557. Now, at the 6 month mark, the Charizard was still holding water. We've talked about that. The Charizard was a fascinating card to watch over the last year. It had a really set ceiling, and it also had a really set floor, which was fascinating. And it kind of bounced up around between $100, $120 for a long time. And you can see at the 6 month mark, the raw card was about the same at $115, but the PSA 10 had come down significantly. That very first Charizard PSA 10 sold for $710, right? And so it was down to $319 at that time, down 55%. And since 151 has been out for a year, September marked the 1 year mark, like you can see where it's at over the course of the year. Again, raw card was pretty much the same, and the PSA 10 was up a little bit versus the 6 month mark, but still down considerably from that 710 first sale. And then the Magikarp from Paldea Evolved, you know, that card took a little while to catch fire. I think it took a bit of time for people to realize that the gem rate in Paldea Evolved was so incredibly low. And so I think that's what added a lot of the excitement to this card further down the road. If you look at 6 months, the raw card was up 49%, but then when you get to the 1 year mark, like you see at the 1 year mark, the PSA 10 is up 43% versus the start, and the raw card is up 229 versus where it started. Now, that is one thing to consider, but let's see how things had moved, right? So if you had bought these at the very beginning, at that start mark, right? If you had bought it at the start mark, guess what? You see a lot of green on here, which we didn't see in the previous slide, right? When you bought versus the start mark in the Sword and Shield era, there were some gains, but nothing like this. And then look at the 6 month mark. Again, if you had bought these cards at the 6 month mark, all of them are green. The PSA 10s are green, you know, the raw cards are green. And then if you bought at the 1 year mark, again, you're starting to see all of it, except that Magikarp. The Magikarp is down a little bit from the 1 year mark. But that is why I said that I think people are starting to understand and realize where these cards are going to stack rank in the long run. I think the investors and collectors are starting to jump in a little earlier. So we shall see. This certainly doesn't mean that when Prismatic Evolutions comes out, you should wait a year. It doesn't mean that when Prismatic Evolutions comes out, you should jump right in, because the Scarlet and Violet era is totally different. All I do is present a lot of data for you guys to ingest and think about. But I did think it was very interesting to see how the modern cards, or the ultra modern cards, are moving compared to those Evolving Skies cards. So I had a ton of fun with this video. I'll tell you right now, if you want my honest opinion, I always wait quite a while after a set comes out. Even if I miss out on great opportunities, I like to have some certainty to it, and I'm just going to wait for a little bit. You know, Surging Sparks is dropping, so it's going to be really interesting to see how Surging Sparks performs over the first couple months, if we see the same trends that we saw on these 3 cards here, because certainly know we're going to have some big chase cards in Surging Sparks. So listen, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you had fun with this data. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up, and as always, if you made it to the end and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. I hope you have an awesome one. I appreciate you more than I can say. I'll talk to you later. Thanks, everybody. Bye.